जिंदगी के सफर में लोग कदम कदम पे हमें जज करते हैं। ये अतरंगी, ये क्या एक्टिंग करेगा। अब इसी नाप तोल के चक्कर में कई दरवाजे खुलने से पहले ही बंद हो जाते हैं। मैडम, सिंगल लेडीज को मैं किराएदार रखूंगा तो सोसाइटी मुझे रेड लाइट दिखा देगी। यू नो, वीड लव टू हायर यू बट वी फील इट विल मेक आवर कस्टमर्स अ बिट अनकंफर्टेबल। शादी और इससे अंधी हूं क्या? अफसोस कि लोग ये जांचते हैं कि आपका सर किसके सामने झुकता है, आप कहां से आए हैं, किस खानदान से हैं, कमाते कितना है। काश जिंदगी में सब इस बेंच की तरह होते हैं, सबके लिए एक समान। ये बैठने वाले से उसकी उम्र, जात पात, औकात, रंग, रूप, वेश, भाषा कुछ नहीं पूछती। बिल्कुल कोटा केट 11 की तरह। ये भी आपसे कुछ नहीं पूछता, बस एक सवाल पूछता है कि आप इंडियन हैं, और अगर आप हैं तो आपका स्वागत है।
Jubilant Ingravia is a global integrated life science products and innovative solution provider serving pharmaceutical, agrochemical, consumer and industrial customers with our customized products and solutions that are innovative, cost effective and conforming to excellent quality standards. In Jubilant Ingravia, we have 3 business segments: specialty chemicals, life science chemicals and nutrition and health solutions. In each of these 3 business segments, the business leaders have their key strategic plan to grow their business and profitability. In each of these business, they have huge investments coming forward through the new products and new customer acquisitions. There cannot be better time than now. We all are coming out with a pandemic situation last year in 2020, and now we see a huge business opportunity in India, specifically in specialty chemical and CDMO, both in pharmaceutical and agrochemical. Since last 2-3 years in life science ingredient business, we have been focusing on efficiency improvement, asset utilization, product mix improvements and debt reduction. And now we have reached to a situation where the business is poised for tangible growth in future.
What does tomorrow look like? To us, it looks like a world of boundless possibilities. At Mahindra, we push our limits every day so that we can rise for a better tomorrow. We rise for good by helping drive sustainability, by creating businesses that transform lives, and empowering the underprivileged in our communities. We futurize by helping design smart cities and smarter lifestyles for an increasingly interconnected world. Tomorrow is a new world, and what we do today defines our tomorrow. At Mahindra, we choose to rise, not just for a few of us, but for all of us.
I can see the future painted in my eyes. Open up the door and fade into the night. Dive into a world I know. Take my hand, follow me into the sun. There's no end. This is where we come alive.
At Standard Chartered, we believe money can be a force for good, which is why we've committed $75 billion to funding sustainable projects in parts of the world that need it most. Because progress doesn't have to cost our planet.
This is where we come alive.
Standard Chartered, here for good.
Farmers rely on fair weather, adequate water, and good fortune to improve productivity. We wondered if our CSR initiatives could add to the other factors.
पहले नाला था तो वो नाला निकल के और ये डैम नहीं बना था तो कहीं करता था, बेके निकल जाता। बरसात में एक फसल लेता था और यो डैम बनो तो पानी बहुत टाइम से भरे रहता, तो हम 2-2, 3 फसलें अभी ले लेता इससे यानी पानी से।
To see the change that has happened, we can look at the fields or we can look at their faces. Just one of the many steps we are taking straight from the heart.
जिंदगी के सफर में लोग कदम कदम पे हमें जज करते हैं। ये अतरंगी, ये क्या एक्टिंग करेगा? अब इसी नाप तोल के चक्कर में कई दरवाजे खुलने से पहले ही बंद हो जाते हैं। मैडम, सिंगल लेडीज को मैं किराएदार रखूंगा तो सोसाइटी मुझे रेड लाइट दिखा देगी। यू नो, वीड लव टू हायर यू बट वी फील इट विल मेक आवर कस्टमर्स अ बिट अनकंफर्टेबल। शादी और इससे अंधी हूं क्या? अफसोस कि लोग ये जांचते हैं कि आपका सर किसके सामने झुकता है, आप कहां से आए हैं, किस खानदान से हैं, कमाते कितना है। काश जिंदगी में सब इस बेंच की तरह होते हैं, सबके लिए एक समान। ये बैठने वाले से उसकी उम्र, जात, पात, औकात, रंग, रूप, वेश, भाषा कुछ नहीं पूछती। बिल्कुल कोटा केट 11 की तरह। ये भी आपसे कुछ नहीं पूछता, बस एक सवाल पूछता है कि आप इंडियन हैं, और अगर आप हैं तो आपका स्वागत है।
Jubilant Ingravia is a global integrated life science products and innovative solution provider serving pharmaceutical, agrochemical, consumer and industrial customers with our customized products and solutions that are innovative, cost effective and conforming to excellent quality standards. In Jubilant Ingravia, we have 3 business segments: specialty chemicals, life science chemicals and nutrition and health solutions. In each of these 3 business segments, the business leaders have their key strategic plan to grow their business and profitability. In each of these business, they have huge investments coming forward through the new products and new customer acquisitions. There cannot be better time than now. We all are coming out with a pandemic situation last year in 2020. And now we see a huge business opportunity in India, specifically in specialty chemical and CDMO, both in pharmaceutical and agrochemical. Since last 2-3 years in life science ingredient business, we have been focusing on efficiency improvement, asset utilization, product mix improvements and debt reduction. And now we have reached to a situation where the business is poised for tangible growth in future.
What does tomorrow look like? To us, it looks like a world of boundless possibilities. At Mahindra, we push our limits every day so that we can rise for a better tomorrow. We rise for good by helping drive sustainability, by creating businesses that transform lives, and empowering the underprivileged in our communities. We futurize by helping design smart cities and smarter lifestyles for an increasingly interconnected world. Tomorrow is a new world, and what we do today defines our tomorrow. At Mahindra, we choose to rise, not just for a few of us, but for all of us.
I can see the future painted in my eyes. Open up the door and fade into the night. Dive into a world I know. Take my hand, follow me into the sun. There's no end. This is where we come alive.
At Standard Chartered, we believe money can be a force for good,
Where we come alive.
which is why we've committed $75 billion to funding sustainable projects in parts of the world that need it most.
Bring
Because progress doesn't have to cost our planet.
This is where we come alive.
Standard Chartered, here for good.
Farmers rely on fair weather, adequate water, and good fortune to improve productivity. We wondered if our CSR initiatives could add to the other factors.
पहले नाला था तो वो नाला निकल के वो डैम नहीं बना था तो कहीं करता था बेके निकल जाता बरसात में एक फसल लेता था और जो डैम बनो तो पानी बहुत टाइम से भरे रहता तो हम 2-2, 3 फसलें अभी ले लेता इससे यानी पानी से.
To see the change that has happened, we can look at the fields, or we can look at their faces. Just one of the many steps we are taking, straight from the heart.
जिंदगी के सफर में लोग कदम कदम पे हमें जज करते हैं. ये अतरंगी, ये क्या एक्टिंग करेगा? अब इसी नाप तोल के चक्कर में कई दरवाजे खुलने से पहले ही बंद हो जाते हैं. मैडम, सिंगल लेडीज को मैं किराएदार रखूंगा तो सोसाइटी मुझे रेड लाइट दिखा देगी. यू नो, we'd love to hire you, but we feel it'll make our customers a bit uncomfortable. शादी और इससे अंधी हूं क्या? अफसोस कि लोग ये जांचते हैं कि आपका सर किसके सामने झुकता है, आप कहां से आए हैं, किस खानदान से हैं, कमाते कितना है. काश जिंदगी में सब इस बेंच की तरह होते हैं, सबके लिए एक समान. ये बैठने वाले से उसकी उम्र, जात, पात, औकात, रंग, रूप, वेश, भाषा कुछ नहीं पूछती. बिल्कुल कोटा केट 11 की तरह ये भी आपसे कुछ नहीं पूछता, बस एक सवाल पूछता है, क्या आप इंडियन हैं? और अगर आप हैं तो आपका स्वागत है.
Jubilant Ingravia is a global integrated life science products and innovative solution provider serving pharmaceutical, agrochemical, consumer and industrial customers with our customized products and solutions that are innovative, cost-effective and conforming to excellent quality standards. In Jubilant Ingravia, we have 3 business segments: specialty chemicals, life science chemicals and nutrition and health solutions. In each of these 3 business segments, the business leaders have their key strategic plan to grow their business and profitability. In each of these business, they have huge investments coming forward through the new products and new customer acquisitions. There cannot be better time than now. We all are coming out with a pandemic situation last year in 2020, and now we see a huge business opportunity in India, specifically in specialty chemical and CDMO, both in pharmaceutical and agrochemical. Since last 2-3 years in life science ingredient business, we have been focusing on efficiency improvement, asset utilization, product mix improvements and debt reduction. And now we have reached to a situation where the business is poised for tangible growth in future.
What does tomorrow look like? To us, it looks like a world of boundless possibilities. At Mahindra, we push our limits every day so that we can rise for a better tomorrow. We rise for good by helping drive sustainability, by creating businesses that transform lives, and empowering the underprivileged in our communities. We futurize by helping design smart cities and smarter lifestyles for an increasingly interconnected world. Tomorrow is a new world, and what we do today defines our tomorrow. At Mahindra, we choose to rise, not just for a few of us, but for all of us.
I can see the future painted in my eyes. Open up the door and fade into the night. Dive into a world I know. Take where we come alive.
At Standard Chartered, we believe money can be a force for good,
Where we come alive.
which is why we've committed $75 billion to funding sustainable projects in parts of the world that need it most. Because progress doesn't have to cost our planet.
This is where we come alive.
Standard Chartered, here for good.
Farmers rely on fair weather, adequate water, and good fortune to improve production.
Okay, I think let's, since we are now, Anish, we have 2 minutes, I think.
Anish, you're muted. Please unmute. So we can start, Mr. Chaudhary.
Okay, fair enough. First of all, I think very good afternoon to all of you on behalf of CII and my personal behalf. I would like to welcome you to this very important session on building competitive value chains as part of CII's first ever Global Economic Policy Summit. And the issue of value chains has become even more important. Already it has been dominating, I think, in a sense, trade literature for some time. But the pandemic has, in some sense, brought about a completely new dimension. Apart from that, the trade tensions between US and China, as a result of which the usual supply chains have got disrupted, bottlenecks have happened. There were, of course, huge logistic issues. Hopefully the global world has got over that. But there is obviously a shift in the thought process of how best to place these value chains in the light of these developments. Do we concentrate only on the sort of cost effectiveness and sort of splitting up the value chain into multiple parts? Is proximity an issue? Is resilience an issue? So these are some of the points that that need to be discussed in a more global context, but more so in the context of India. I think this is something that is becoming increasingly important given India's renewed emphasis on manufacturing and on exports. And one of the issues that I think this panel, and I'll come to introducing the panel, we have a very distinguished panel, but in just a minute, is the issue of integration between trade and investment. Now, this is one area which is in some sense, I would say, at the centerpiece of building competitive value chains. And those who have done it, if you take the examples of the Koreans in automobiles or in electronics, the Japanese as well, they have used trade and investment as integral parts of the same strategy. They have not been isolated instances, but an integrated approach. And this is best seen, for example, in even the trade agreements that they have negotiated, where, for example, if you look at the trade agreement with India, you have preferential duty for the steel which goes into manufacturing of automobiles. And you know that the Koreans are present in a big way in India as far as automobiles are concerned. In fact, they were the first to come in '98, I remember, with Hyundai in Chennai and so on. Now, they have used that, they have relocated, and they have also used the trade agreement sort of tariff preference as a way of being able to get one of the most important components duty free into India. And there are many other examples. Now, in the larger context of policy orientation, how does one ensure that trade and investment sort of are in complete sync with each other? And from equally, I would say, in a parallel sense, from the industry point of view, and that is where I think one of the panelists will come in. How do you sort of get this integration of trade and investment into your business decision making? This is something that I think needs to be done on a far more focused way in India. To some extent, I do believe that investment decisions have not necessarily been integrated with trade and have often been decisions in their own right. But how does one do this? There is a foreign trade policy for India, which is up for review pretty soon and will be coming up. Now, that is also something that I'm sure we could debate and look at. How is this policy bringing about sort of greater integration in the two regions? The third one and the last one, of course, is the entire issue of logistics, cost of doing business, and etc. The infrastructure, whether it is physical infrastructure, whether it is digital connectivity. And in these days, digital connectivity is particularly important. How do these play a part in the building up of competitive value chains? We all know they do. Now, what exactly can be done? Is trade facilitation sort of something that can help? Can, for example, some of the commitments that are being sort of thought of in the WTO context and which may likely to come in much later, can in the region these commitments be fast-tracked, for example? Would that help in the growth of the regional value chains and so on? So these are some of the intriguing questions that I think we should address in this panel. And at this stage, let me introduce a very, very distinguished panel. I can't think of sort of a panel that is more apt to discuss these issues, and let me introduce them one by one. A very warm welcome to Dr. Harshvardhan Singh, and we go back a long way, of course, to school. So welcome, Harsh. He's the chairman of the IKD HVJ Advisors LLP, and of course, as most of you know, has been Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organization for 2 terms. And earlier also, he has worked in the WTO Secretariat. His work in TRI, for example, I recollect that was the time when telecom reforms in India were taking a big leap. And I know this Dr. Harshvardhan Singh had a huge role to play, I think, in the development of the telecom regulatory setup, which is so critical in the services sector, along with liberalization. So, and he's worked extensively in this area. As written, I don't need to sort of mention. So, Harsh, we certainly look forward to hearing from you. I would also like to welcome Robert Kookman, who is the Dr. Robert Kookman, Chief Economist and Director of the Economic Research and Statistics Division of the World Trade Organization. Now, we all know that it is this division which is really, in a sense, the fulcrum of the data and the analysis that makes the members sort of take positions or take stands and so on. And we know that Robert, in fact, I'm told, has also done seminal work on value chains recently. And I'm certain that he would probably illuminate on this much more. He is a very distinguished economist and has deep understanding of trade. I also warm welcome to another old friend, Dr. Amitendu Palit, Senior Research Fellow and Research Lead in Trade and Economics at the Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore. Now, Dr. Palit has specialized in the area of international trade, FTAs, particularly supply chains, cross-border data flows. He also sits on the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Trade and Investment. So good to have you, Amitendu, on this panel. finally, Dr. Anish Shah, last but not the least, representing the sort of, I can say, the private sector, and certainly one of the most important areas in when you talk of building competitive value chains, the automobile sector. And he is the managing director and CEO of Mahindra and Mahindra, which we all know has a global footprint. He has worked closely with all businesses of the Mahindra Group on key strategic initiatives, and I'm sure that he will bring in the private perspective on this issue. And so at this, I would like to invite, I think, what I would suggest is that maybe each of us, we have 4 panelists, could speak for 10 or 12 minutes each, covering some of the areas that we have mentioned. And then after that, we could possibly focus on some critical questions that emerge out of this panel discussion. So I would sort of say that let us start maybe with Dr. Anish Shah to set the private sector perspective in view, and particularly maybe very briefly on the auto sector sort of value chain issues, and what you think are the ways ahead for India to kind of hook into this in a much bigger way, both in a regional and the global value context, given the paradigm shift in the supply chains that are now emerging. And how is that, for example, impacted even the Indian auto sector? So Dr. Anish Shah, the floor is yours.
So thank you, Dr. Chaudhary. Let me start with the realities that we face today. We are seeing supply chain disruptions that have been frankly unprecedented. At the high level, we talk about semiconductors as being an issue. But if we look into semiconductors in detail, just one example is one model that we have, the XEV 700, has 170 different components that have semiconductors in it. And similarly, there are various different models that will have different components that have semiconductors in it. Typically, we've always looked at our suppliers and assessed risk from the suppliers. And you might have a dashboard that looks all green saying, yes, things are well under control. But in the world today, where a semiconductor plant in Malaysia, for example, may be shut because of COVID, it stops supplying the semiconductors to a large number of auto component companies that eventually supply auto companies. The question then is, where were those semiconductors going? Into which of those 170 parts for this one model, or a few hundred other parts for other models? And we get a message back from the auto component suppliers saying, we don't have semiconductors that go into this part anymore, so this part is not going to be sent to you. Now you have an auto plant running, and you've got everything for the car that can be built except for this one part. In some cases, it was a $2 semiconductor that impacted one component, and you have a $2 semiconductor impacted on a $20,000 or $40,000 car. That throws the entire production schedule out of gear. And this is something that happens on a regular basis. So every 2 weeks, there's another message saying this part may not be available, or we can't tell you what's going to happen to this part till the end of this month. At that point, we'll tell you for the next month, but we cannot give you any visibility beyond the next month. So supply chain, as someone said, has moved from just in time to just in case. But as we are seeing here, it's not only just in case. It has become a highly complex set of algorithms that need to be run on a real-time basis to account for things that are changing. And therefore, we have to adapt in many different ways. What we've realized is we cannot rely on having one supplier in many cases. There's a benefit to single sourcing, a benefit to just in time, but those things may not exist in future. You need to have multiple suppliers. You need to have, therefore, car models designed in a way where the volume increases, and there are various parts that are designed differently in every model that we have. We're looking at that and saying, should we have similar parts in every model? There are some parts like the handle that you hold while sitting in the car. That part should be the same in most of our models. even infotainment systems. That may not be the same in all models, but at least across some models, you could have similar infotainment systems. So we're going through that process right now, and I'm sure every manufacturer will go through that to say, how can we simplify? So simplification is going to become an important part here. Based on simplification, how can we diversify? That's the second part. And therefore minimize the risk of it coming from one supplier, because one supplier may be buying from their plant in Malaysia, but someone else may be buying from that plant in Taiwan or some other part of the world. And therefore that diversification will help at least get some supplies in, or you can get a little more supply from a certain point in time. So simplification, diversification, and flexibility. Those are the three main components in terms of how this supply chain will change as we go forward. Now, take it to the next level in terms of what happens across countries. We've again heard a lot of talk about the China plus one strategy. What I outlined here in a little more detail for the auto industry is something that is going to be very similar across countries. A lot of companies are uncomfortable having a sole reliance on a particular country because a disruption in that country may result in a disruption entirely for your supply chain. And therein lies an opportunity for India. As we would look at various industries, and while I'll talk more about the industries we are in, today, India is at a position where our manufacturers are manufacturing world-class products in many industries. I go back to our example in auto, the XUV 700 generated 50,000 bookings in 3 hours. That is 9,500 crores of sales, or close to $1.4 billion of sales in 3 hours. That product is a world-class product today, will stand up against any product in the world. This has broken records across the auto industry globally. But that's just one example. There are many such examples across many industries, and many of our manufacturers are building those world-class products. The question then is, how do we get not only our products, our component makers, and even our MSMEs in a supply chain that can parallel China, where it's not just a China plus one strategy. Global manufacturers look at a China plus India strategy. What is required to make that happen? And here I would look at a few things. First is the infrastructure. And it essentially comes down to the ability to deliver these products at a lower cost and at a higher speed. Infrastructure will help on both counts. The second is trade policies and arrangements we have with different countries. In many cases, our manufacturers compete with global players who have a 5, 10, 15, 20% advantage from a tariff standpoint. How do you find a way to eliminate that? The third is, how can we make it simpler for companies that want to set up shop in India or expand in India, reduce the compliances required, and the ease of business is a major focus area. Now, the good news on all of these three fronts is that at least what we see in the last 3 or 4 years, the government is taking very significant steps in all of these areas and really accelerating the efforts here, which is going to position India much better right now. That is the effort where, with CII and participation from the industry, we should work closely with the government to accelerate it even further to make our industries a lot more competitive. So in summary, I think we do have a lot of challenges today, but I also do see a lot of opportunity and the ability to position India and its manufacturing component as well as MSME sectors extremely well on the global stage today.
Well, thank you, Dr. Anisha. Certainly, I think there are 2 or 3 critical lessons from what you just said. One, of course, is this entire issue of diversification that you just mentioned. But easier said than done. I think it is something that is, to me, almost tautological. But how do you really diversify, particularly in the short or medium term? And is there something that you can do to promote this over at least the medium term, if not the long term? The second, of course, was this issue of over reliance, which is the same thing. The two go hand in hand. And finally, of course, is this entire issue of both trade policy and trade agreements, which is one side, which is something I will come back to. And I think that is a very critical component that we need to discuss. And then this issue of which I mentioned, which is broadly bringing down the costs, whether it is through logistics, whether it is through ease of doing business, whether it is paperless trading, all of them essentially bring down the costs and increase the speed, as Anish rightly said. But maybe these we keep at the back of our mind, but this is the right time, I think, to move to Dr. Harshvardhan Singh with his sort of huge experience in a global context. And I'm sure that Dr. Harsh will like to speak on how do you sort of probably integrate trade and investment, both in a systemic context and in the context of particularly India and its trade policy and trade agreements. So without further ado, the floor is yours, Harsh.
Thank you, Sumanta. And thank you very much for laying the groundwork, Dr. Anisha. The way I see it is that we are focusing on 2-3 things. If one looks at the thrust of this session, one is consistency between trade policy and investment policy. Second is how that can be oriented in order to grow the presence of global value chains in India. And third, something which is an aspiration expressed very recently by the Indian Prime Minister. He gave a speech on the 6th of August to heads of Indian missions abroad, where he has emphasized a manifold increase in exports, a much larger presence of India in global value chains, which basically means that a large part of the value chain is actually being produced in India. And also a manifold increase in manufacturing. It's a very rich speech, very well laid out concepts. But I think this is the background in which the policymakers could think of doing some of the things which Dr. Anisha pointed out. So the focus is on 2 things. One is exports, and one is growth of value chains in India with Indian presence. What are the kind of policies which the government should be emphasizing? And we saw the points of concern for the private sector. In this context, we have to understand the key features of a global value chain. A global value chain becomes a global value chain when a product crosses at least 2 borders. Not one, that is conventional one kind of trade, but 2 borders, which means that an imported product comes in and an imported product is processed and leaves. So the first thing is, and this is the basic realization for policy, that if the imported product has to come and be processed and leave, what is the important feature of competition in a global value chain? Global value chains compete in terms of timely actions. So timeliness of the product coming, going, being processed. Second is that the product you produce must be consistent in quality and what is desired in the chain which leads to the final product. So every part of the input should meet certain quality criteria. And of course, something which is quintessential in competition, it must be made at a price or supplied at a price or cost which is competitive. So these are the 3 kind of objectives. What does timeliness depend on? One is the action of the company itself. And second is the policy process which is put in place to facilitate this transit. So that's where trade facilitation and other facilitation policies come in. That's where ease of doing business comes in. So, and everything to do with logistics, etc. And India is emphasizing a lot on these aspects. So when you look at this, the third thing is that actually when we talk about global value chains, we think it is a one big box in which everything comes in. No. Value chains or supply chains, the features of them differs across sectors, which is where industrial policy comes in. So in a global value chain, some of the main participants are lead firms, which manage the chain, or they can be the platform suppliers, who own the technology and even control the functioning. So it differs across different products and areas. And how can it differ? Let's take a look at some of the industries which we are focusing on. Automobiles. Automobiles, actually the lead firms, we have a combination of Indian lead firms and foreign lead firms present in India. You will see that in many contexts, the lead firms are actually present in India. The whole idea is to make them increase their investment and look at export markets. In electronics, the lead firms are primarily, especially for the large dynamic sector, which if you see the electronics production data, mobile phones, the lead firms are foreign. They are present in India. How do we make them look away from or in addition to the domestic market? Because whoever comes to India will look at the domestic market. How do we make them export? How do we make them grow the investments in the country with participation of the Indian producers in it? In textiles and clothing, actually there are different differences. There are two parts. One is the conventional global value chain as we see it, and one is what we call the merchant exporters, which is an aggregator who connects with many small players, aggregates their product, and then sells it abroad. That player can be a lead player or lead firm, but does not necessarily have the same kind of marketing capabilities as a large firm such as Apple or Samsung has in electronics or mobile phone. That firm has to interact with somebody abroad. And that is also a part of the value chain of domestic production and exports. So just these three examples, if you take a look, the kind of facilitating policies, how you treat these different transactions within the chain can be different. I'll give you an example. In textiles clothing, an aggregator connects with a consultant abroad to build the market. When the aggregator pays the consultant, there is a GST on it, and that GST is not refunded. Is that a policy which leads to competitiveness or reduces competitiveness? Similarly, a value chain is the lead firm, contract suppliers with tier 1, 2, 3 kind of. When we talk about China plus one, China has a presence of all these and they function together. Just one large firm coming here does not mean that our participation in the value chain will increase. And we need a lot of capability and time to build the contract suppliers. It will not happen on its own, and the technology just does not exist. And the timeliness of the value chain transactions also have to link up with timeliness of policy response. Now, what does timeliness of policy response means? Two things. You must act immediately to facilitate or make whatever you desire to happen on the ground. And second is, you don't have 5 years, 6 years, 10 years to take your action. Why am I saying this? Look at the date when Trump imposed the tariffs on China. Since that day, we are talking about China plus one, China plus one. When did the policy come into place to actually actuate that aspiration? Last year. So it takes you 2 to 3 years to even formulate that policy. By then, others are also in the game. They are competing with you. When you are competing with others and investment decisions are maybe waiting 1 year, 2 years. Similarly, when you have the lead firm here, they have their contract, they have, if it is plus one, it is not always China plus one. Sometimes it is shifting from China here. The report which you talked about, which WTO with several other agencies has produced a very fine report. It shows that the shifting was not very much. Why? Because one, COVID came. Two, many were maybe looking at what is India doing, because the other place, large place is India. But while they were looking, they were shifting out. 15-20% in aggregate actually shifted out. How much of that came to India? And this is before the PLI basically started functioning in India. So the point I'm making is, if you want the shifting out here and want them to stay, then they must function fully. Their contract suppliers, if they want them to shift, they should also be shifting here so that production starts. We have to see when the FDI produces here together with contract suppliers as the nodes of change and production in India. If that production starts, then the Indian participation begins and the enrichment of capabilities of India begins. If that production starts, the design capabilities, the other brand building, etc., can start taking place within India. So that's where industrial policy comes in. What about trade policy? We have actually focused on trade policy in two different ways. One is tariffs and one is non-tariff measures. As far as tariffs are concerned, if you increase tariffs on, say, a product which you want to protect, take mobile phones, then you're giving protection to that product. The producers will come to India, the main producers. There are Indian producers also here. But there, if you need to increase exports manifold, the ratio for mobile phones is number of phones produced low value, number of phones produced high value. It's 80 to 20 broadly. Low value 80 number phones, high value 20. In value terms, namely if I want to export the total production, just for the sake of argument, it's 20 to 80. 80% of the value is produced by 20% of the phones. If these guys can start exporting, then we will also achieve not just the presence of a lead firm, but also exports. What is required in exports? Competitiveness in terms of cost. Cost comes from scale. What are we doing to enable that? So that this firm, which is in India, is also looking towards the global market. You can't force anybody to export. They have to compete. And when they compete in world markets, they can compete in India also. So if you impose any policy restriction which increases costs, and tariffs on components is definitely one of them, you are actually taking a policy which reduces competitiveness. If you delay, that's the non-tariff measure. If you delay anything of this chain, suppose you have your own standards which you insist on, which the large export markets don't like, don't want. These producers will have to produce with two standards. So how can we make our policy consistent there? Then what we have to see is, what are our competitors doing? Till now, we have focused on improving our position in terms of global ranking. I think we have to focus on that in any case, but we have to focus in terms of our ranking vis-a-vis our main competitors. Let me explain what I'm saying. I took the OECD Trade Facilitation Index, and I took 4 countries. So there is India, there is China, Vietnam, 2 competitors conventionally considered as those which in some key areas are taking markets from us. Mexico and Thailand, for illustration. I could have taken Bangladesh also, etc. But in the case of Bangladesh, more so than others, because it is the least developed country, has been and for several years now, it has taken over market share from clothing. The point which was made with respect to the private sector, the tariffs faced by Bangladesh in the largest market of the world, EU, is 0. Our products pay a tariff of 9 to 9.6%. How do you overcome that and a lack of competitiveness? By creating similar conditions. Vietnam is doing that. Vietnam has had a trade agreement with the EU. The moment we increase our tariffs, in trade agreements, we'll find it that much more difficult to reduce it. So from a dynamic perspective, the global value chains will start being established and functioning in the markets which are more integrated. Because remember, integration is the basis of value chain, global value chain. So we have to have a policy chain concept with the value chain. So whatever policy is happening in one sector, commerce is not the only nodal point or the only one with responsibility for India's exports. A value chain shows everyone has to work together. So coordination mechanisms have to come in. That's industrial policy with a positive approach. You know, the kind of thing which the National Foreign Trade Committee, the Committee on National Committee on Foreign Trade has come in for trade facilitation. Now I'll give you an example from the OECD Trade Facilitation Index. If you take a look, our index average index is better than Vietnam. It's better than Thailand. No, we are just slightly behind China and Mexico. But there are very many components. There are 11 components. If we take those 11 components, India's rank is last for 4 of them and second last for 2 of them. And Vietnam or China are actually superior in most of them as far as we are concerned when we compare. So we have last in involvement of the trade community, where the private sector involvement comes in. We are last in advanced rulings. We are the last in documentations, which means also the regulatory burden of documentation. We are last in procedures. Our procedures actually are more cumbersome and create more problems than all these other 4 which I'm talking about. We are second last in appeal procedures. This is a very important part of the functioning. And fees and charges. What are the fees? Look at our port charges and look at the port charges in some of the other important places. The government of India knows about these differences. It is 1:3 or 1:5. What is it doing and in how quick time is it addressing it? Those things become important. So we have to start focusing in a very focused way on creating these chains with contract suppliers and lead firms. We have to, the moment we raise tariffs, the orientation becomes inward. The person will produce for India. The problem is, India is not such a large market as we normally think. Take in some products it is, so tariffs might work there. In mobile phones, it's 5% of global markets. Vietnam in electronics in 2001 produced 80% of exported 80% of India's exports. In 2020, its exports were 11 times that of India. What did it do? The policies are the kind of consistency facilitating policies plus hand-holding in a way, especially with lead firms, which India has begun to do. As I've taken quite a long time, one last point.
You can wrap up, yeah.
One last point. India's actually implemented a lot of good points. But the problem which in feedback from industry is that implementation is tardy. So the feedback mechanism, a mechanism where industry interacts with the government, the government monitors it using a management. Oh, sorry, I must finish quickly because Bob has to go.
Yeah, I think so.
So we must oversee this implementation process. Sorry, Bob. I'll finish now.
Right. Thanks. And since Dr. Robert Kookman, I believe, has to sort of leave for another meeting, this is the appropriate time for Dr. Kookman to come in and give us his perspective, both in terms of the study that has been undertaken and in the larger context, how do you place India? Dr. Kookman.
Thanks, Mr. Chowdhury, and very, very sincere apologies, but I have a meeting with my boss, Dr. Ngozi, at 8:45. So, I have to say that we have two recent studies that came out. One is the Global Value Chain Development Report that Dr. Singh referred to, and that report is on GVCs beyond manufacturing, beyond production. And much of what we report or find in that research report really supports the points that Dr. Anish Shah mentioned. And we have a second report that we just released the other day, our World Trade Report on Trade and Economic Resilience, which also reinforces many of the points that we heard from the private sector. And that is, there's a big focus on risk mitigation versus absolute pursuit of efficiency. And often around risk mitigation, as Dr. Singh was just mentioning, policy stability is really important. So both flexible yet efficient policy, but its stability around that policy turns out to be really important for firms in making their decisions. So that means that your regulatory environment has to be well-tuned to what you're trying to achieve. You have to, and there's a couple of other pillars here that are very important, and that's investing in human capital, because much of modern value chains depend on technology, modern technology, integration into digital systems. And we know India has an amazing capacity to do this. We've seen it exploited significantly in the services sector, where India has been remarkably successful. And then infrastructure. There's the digital infrastructure, which I think India has good concentration of high-end digital infrastructure, but probably needs to be spread more broadly. But then there's the hard infrastructure, and that's things like ports and roads and the cost efficiency of those roads. So those are very, very important elements there. We call them pillar activities, and they involve technology, know-how, bringing in cost competitiveness, and getting that technology and know-how is the route for foreign direct investment. So much of it can be domestic, but what you often find in successful integration into value chains is taking local capacity and finding ways to mix that effectively with foreign capacity, either know-how or technology, and improve your products. In our report, we give a couple of examples, one around windmills, which is an older example where we compare the Danish firm Vestas with an Indian firm Zuslan, and how Zuslan very quickly built a competitive and resilient supply chain to become competitive. And we have another example around Chinese phone producers, Xiaomi, Oppo, and Huawei, where they really relied on imported parts and components and technology, where they actually did what we heard from Dr. Anish Shah. They tried to standardize. And we call this modularity. where you basically can take existing standardized products, incorporate them into your own product, and generate more value in your sales. And that's very, very interesting, very, very important, where they were able to rely on Korean, Japanese, US parts and components and get a much greater share of the end value of their domestic and more competitive in international markets by meeting those standards. So I think these are all very, very important elements. How do you fine tune? How do you get the right FDI in? I think those are important decisions that the Indian government needs to make. And then don't forget, there are global value chains, but often global value chains build on regional value chains and integration into your regional suppliers and competitors, both for a sales market and for importing parts, efficient parts and components that help you become more competitive in the global market. My final comment, if I may, in the report, that global value chain report, you'll see that the center of global value chain demand, so rather, China is often viewed as the center of global value chain production. We see that changing and evolving over time. But the center for global value chain demand has not changed, and it is the United States. So the United States is one of those key markets that remains at this point the major source for global sales, and very important ones, often with high margins, and finding a way to build Indian brands to penetrate that market, perhaps by exploiting both your domestic and regional markets to build those brands, I think would help you penetrate that growing source of demand. But my guess is, if I look at this data in 10 to 15 years, we're going to see China's growing as a growing source of demand, and that will be followed by India. So, preparing yourself for the evolution of where the final products are going to be sold is going to be very important. I'll stop there. I do have to run. Thank you very much for the opportunity to join you, and very, very interesting interventions. And I'm sorry I can't stay for the rest of it. I apologize.
Well, thank you, Robert. And we do understand that you have a meeting to attend, but thanks for sharing this view. And I'm sure that all of us would like to read these reports and the takeaways that you mentioned, and try and see to what extent we could integrate them in our own policies. So with this, thanks for joining this panel. And on behalf of CII and myself, I would like to once again extend my sincere gratitude to you, Robert.
Thank you. Thank you.
At this stage, I would now move on to Dr. Amitendu Palit, and I'm sure, given his experience in this Asia-Pacific region on which he has specialized, certainly I think Dr. Palit would, I'm sure, in his sort of intervention, cover the regional value chain aspect in this part. And as I said earlier, the way value chains are paradigm is changing. We heard from Dr. Anish Shah and from Dr. Harshvardhan Singh. But Amitendu, the floor is yours. Please proceed.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chaudhary, and thank you, CII, for inviting me to this very enlightening panel discussion. Let me also say the view that for some particular reason, I might just be experiencing a little bit of disruption in the bandwidth. So I thought that I'll switch off my video just to enable a greater clarity in expression of the view. So please don't mind my switching off the video. What I wanted to reflect on at this outset is the fact that we did hear a lot of conversation about the competitiveness of supply chains, but what has become extremely pertinent over the last 18 months that we have seen in the aftermath of the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic is the debate surrounding the resilience of supply chains. Now, what is understandable is that the question of resilience and to what extent supply chains are able to overcome the difficulties faced by them from exogenous developments is what is being termed as resilience. And that resilience in turn is impacting their ability to compete effectively. Now, what we have seen historically over the examples that have come for the last 10 to 15 years is that supply chains have been disrupted. It's not for the first time that it's only the COVID-19 that led to a disruption in supply chains. We have seen enough disruptions arising out of a lot of natural catastrophes, like, say, for example, the Fukushima disaster, the Thai floods, subsequently the Hurricane Sandy in the United States, and then obviously later tumultuous political developments like the Arab Spring and so on and so forth, which have all in their own ways affected supply chains across the world, and particularly the Asia-Pacific region in some way or other. But what we saw in the aftermath of COVID-19 was something rather different. First, this brought to notice the fact that there could be a situation, and that situation is summarized by the outbreak of the pandemic itself, where a large number of supply chains at the same time can simultaneously face disruptions. It's not a question of one supply chain being disrupted, but it's a large number of supply chains together. So the automobile supply chain can be as badly affected as the food supply chain and the pharmaceutical supply chain, leading to a scenario where countries face a very different kind of crisis. And this is where the question of resilience and the discussion on supply chains actually graduates from a firm level or a business level discussion to a country level discussion. And this is for the first time that we notice in the history of the conversation of supply chains that countries start getting involved in talking about supply chains earlier. It were the firms who were talking between themselves about the importance of sustaining resilience, about the importance of making themselves share much more data within their networks and alert themselves in advance so that possible disruptions can be avoided. But today, to a very large extent, in the COVID-19 aftermath, that responsibility and that initiative appears to have been taken over by countries. So the first outcome of this entire development is the fact that countries have come together in trying to work out models and strategies through which resilience can be taken forward. And to that extent, what has also happened is that there are specific initiatives that have started coming in, like the supply chain resilience initiative that we have seen in the Asia-Pacific region between Japan, India, and Australia. The Quad group of countries, including Japan, India, Australia, and the United States, have now started putting together a lot more thought and initiative into areas of supply chains. The same has been iterated at the G7 group of countries meetings and also at the level of G20. The other point that's very interesting to note in this regard is that the countries are actually getting involved into the supply chain conversation because of the connect that is shaping around supply chains with respect to geo-economics and geopolitics. We have, as Dr. Seth earlier mentioned, diversification is a very important issue, and supply chains do tend to get affected from the problem of lack of diversification because of the fact that there is excessive sourcing dependence. But today there is a realization that excessive sourcing dependency can actually create issues that are inimical to national interest and security. And this is not just respect to China, but even with respect to the fact that when one looks at subjects like semiconductors, for example, the fact that semiconductor production to a very large extent is dependent on what is happening in certain parts of the Asia-Pacific, and it is not just a lockdown in China that will affect semiconductor production, but also similar lockdowns in Taiwan and Malaysia, which can affect such production, makes countries realize that it is not just the issue of working together, but working together among countries who are similarly affected and on the same page as far as coming together in safeguarding supply chains are concerned. One also at this stage needs to note the fact is with very much strong command over raw materials and inputs and components will have a proclivity or might have a proclivity to weaponize that advantage. And since weaponization of that advantage can be a tacit objective to obtain certain economic influence, there is no denying the fact that all conversations around supply chains have become very strongly geopolitically motivated. But the question that arises over here is that when geopolitics becomes a driver of supply chain reshoring or supply chain orientation, does it match the business configuration? Does it match the logic of economic efficiency on the basis of which these supply chains were initially constructed? This will continue to remain a challenge and a struggle as we go ahead in checking to what extent supply chains have been able to achieve resilience. And the challenge for trade policy and ongoing FTA negotiations that come up in is that if resilience of supply chains is an important subject, and within that space, resilience of supply chains using critical technology, sensitive technology, critical materials become important, then how can trade rules be adjusted or created to fix themselves around a group of supply chain reconfigurations? This is a completely new challenge for trade policy, because this is where trade policy has to react to a response that is coming top down. It's not getting bottom up. There is already a desirable objective that has been planted and that's given forward to the trade policy agenda around which trade policy has to fix itself. So this is actually the biggest challenge that upcoming trade negotiations and alignment of trade routes need to configure themselves around. So I'll stop over there. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Amitendu, and I think you have brought out, I think, some of the critical features that are now come into emergence. And I think one very critical point that you mentioned is this transition from a firm level to a country level sort of influence over supply chains. And that sort of fits in well with the issue of an overall trade and investment strategy. Now, let me sort of now, in some sense, get back, since we do have time, on some particular issues that have been thrown up and open it up to the panel. But first, I thought since Anish took the floor first, and he has now heard, I think, both Dr. Harshvardhan and Dr. Amitendu Palit, and of course, briefly, Dr. Robert Kookman. Anish, would you like to sort of at least get back on some of the issues that you'd probably like to see sort of happening, possibly in the context of the foreign trade policy review also happening, that would certainly impact and have sort of more positive influence on the agenda that we are just discussing. And of course, if you want to react on any of the issues that have been raised, you're most free to do so. Anish?
So I would start with first a comment that Dr. Kookman made on standardization. I think that is an important one. It's not just standardization by manufacturers. It is also standard that are set for various different things by the government in certain cases. A classic example here is as we look at batteries for electric vehicles. Can we develop specific standards around them and therefore have the entire ecosystem work as one? Because then that goes beyond a particular manufacturer to the entire ecosystem. And there are many such examples. So that's one part. Coming back to your question specifically on trade agreements and trade policies, there are various angles to it. There are various political angles to it, various economic angles to it. I do feel that the government is doing everything it can now to accelerate that. But the end outcomes should really be around creating a level playing field for us versus our competitors globally in key markets around the world.
Okay, thanks. Now on sort of on certain issues that I think have emerged in this discussion, on the question of, I think, which Dr. Harshvardhan raised, he sort of did mention very clearly, of course, the export orientation that the Honorable Prime Minister had mentioned in a recent speech. And this is also borne out by, in some sense, the export buoyancy that we are seeing this year. And the expectations are of reaching $400 billion of exports in this financial year. We all know that in the recent past, exports have not done maybe as well, but this year there's a quantum jump. There's 500 is the next horizon that we have to see. And with that, we also put in context the fact that there is a renewed negotiation of free trade agreements that the government and the Commerce Ministry has announced with many trade partners, whether it is the resurrection of the India-EU FTA, the one with the UK, now UK with Brexit. UK, of course, is no longer part of the EU. So that's the integrated EU component, the unfinished business with Australia and Canada, the sort of other agreements that we are talking of in the Middle East. And of course, we cannot forget the African region. And particularly, I think I would draw attention to the fact that we now have an intercontinental free trade agreement in Africa being sort of implemented. The tariff reductions have already begun. Very importantly, the services liberalization will start as well. Now, in this larger context, I would like Dr. Harshvardhan Singh to maybe sort of keeping this in view and keeping that this is something, how do we sort of, in some sense, put this entire orientation of exports and renewed interest in FTAs with some of the points that you raised in terms of the issues relating to either raising tariffs or having different sets of standards for domestic manufacturers and exporters and so on. And how do you place it in this context and the larger context of the free trade agreements that we are now sort of beginning again to sort of re-emerge? Harsh.
Thank you, Sumanta. Again, very important points, and all the points which were made by various speakers, I thought they are very, very substantive and have to be seen within an overall interlinked framework. Now, the standardization initiative, China was able to do that because it basically turned from a standard taker to a standard maker. So we have to see, and that's where, when I said we have to learn from what our competing economies are doing, if we set a standard which is very different from the world at this stage, rather than having a 10-year horizon, etc., which is what China does, and working on products which, so they worked very in a focused manner on producing something at home at a lower cost. You know, so solar panels is one example. It's replete, even in electronics. What they did is they did not fundamentally change the standard. They improved upon the attributes of the product while maintaining a standard which could be used along the way. And that is what standardization is. And then the domestic firms developed in a bigger way with the help from the public sector banks, etc. We have now started focusing in some way on that. But the PLI schemes, if you see how we are changing the tariff structure, especially imposing tariffs on imports, and you do the calculations on how much are we actually reducing the competitiveness due to that, some estimations suggest that in certain select cases, it almost wipes out the benefit you are providing by PLI. So we must see the consistency of these policies. That's why industrial policy and trade policy become important. And facilitation and timeliness and effective implementation are key there, together with discussions with industry to see where you can support. And in terms of FTA negotiations, the Indian government has made announcements and is making very strong efforts to reignite old discussions which had been sidelined, plus start new ones. The main thing in FTAs is that people are looking for access to your market through tariff reduction. Plus, there are a lot of rules which address facilitation and the non-tariff measures. The problem we had with Korea and Japan, etc., is the non-tariff measure. In any case, we didn't open up as much of the market with are deep agreements, such as Japan and Korea also, as the African, the continental, transcontinental agreement is doing. They are focusing on 90% going to zero. And that is the minimum. And that's what RCEP was trying to do, for example, which we got out of. So first of all, we have to devise ways in which we can manage that process. And there are ways. We have examples of flexibilities, of safeguards, etc., which we can put together and negotiate with that objective. Because if we don't want to open up at least that much, then we are making efforts, but those efforts, as in the case of effective policy implementation, effective negotiations, will not come to fruition the way we would like it, the level playing field in global markets. You made a very important point of where all we have the FTAs with. So as Bob Kookman said, these large markets are important. One is FTA, and second is the ability of the major firms to place these products in that market. So it's not like conventional trade, it's conventional trade in the context of a global value chain. The lead firms have that ability. So our link with lead firms have to be strengthened in that context also. Plus, we have to see, I talked about Vietnam. Look at the number of FTAs Vietnam's got. And what does FTA do? It is not just that we can export more, it also encourages investment into your country to take advantage. You are building a trade value chain nexus plus an investment value chain nexus. And the two are two sides of the same coin. The third thing is that now international trade transactions are determined by digital transactions, and they have implications on how trade is being conducted. So that aspect should also come in. The fourth one, and this in my view is very important, we find negotiating FTAs very difficult, but we can still try and get access to foreign markets through our bilateral mechanisms to address non-tariff measures. So you can have a bilateral agreement with the country which you focus on, or maybe a trilateral or whatever, to establish a process where you bring your concern that your exports are not going in because of certain non-tariff measures also. There is a provision in the CPTPP on this, which is 2.9.2, where they have established a process where you face problems in placing your exports, and then you bring that to the other country. But please remember, the other country will bring the same thing to you. So you must have that, with that perspective, facilitation and an agreement to open up. So, and of course, the point made by Amitendu is very, very important, which India is doing a good job on the geopolitics kind of thing. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Harsh. Those are very, very important sort of, I would say, perspectives. I do believe that Anish has to leave. Any closing thoughts, Anish? Or otherwise, of course, thanks once again for joining this discussion. And in case you have one or two closing words, you're most welcome.
I would just say that this was an excellent discussion, some very relevant comments that were made by all the panelists. And if we can implement some of these working jointly, I think that would make a huge difference to India and all our industries.
Okay.
Thank you again for having me here.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now, getting back to Dr. Palit and Amitendu, I think the Asia Pacific region, and I'm deliberately sort of saying, we all know that this is a critical region. We do have sort of trade agreements covering this region in different formats. Now, in this context and in the context of what you just said about countries getting involved in supply chain management and supply chain decision making on either on a sector specific level or even at a national industry level, how do you see the supply chain sort of issues, and where does India sort of can get into this? Is there something that specifically we could do, particularly, as I said, in the context of the Asia Pacific region? Amitendu.
Thank you, Shimontula, for those. I think India has an advantage in the sense that when one looks at the country-specific imperatives that are guiding supply chains, obviously in subjects like vaccines.
I think your connection is a bit unstable.
Typically are India's area trend insofar as the. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hello, can you hear me now? Yeah, I'm
yes,
sorry,
I
switched
can.
off the video.
You can, I think.
Yeah, I switched off the video. So, say for example, when it comes to vaccines, and that is an important part of the supply chain initiative within the group of Quad group of countries, there's already a plan which has been put out, and India has been able to participate in that plan on the basis of its comparative advantages and strengths. Similarly, there are other areas where India will be able to play along with its strengths, but there are areas where the challenges for India will critically be determined by its access to resources, by its ability to understand those issues, and by the ability to respond to those. And one of the areas where I think this is really going to be substantial is that one of the problems with supply chains is that because of digitalization, a lot of supply chains are not fully visible these days. In the sense, when it comes to, let us say, digital delivery, a lot of digital delivery is taking place through apps, through web-enabling platforms like the Google Drive. So as a result of all this, what is happening is that there is a lot which tends to go into regulations which need to be panned out within a specific set of country-based discussions, and maybe in all of these areas, India might not be well prepared to take forward those discussions. So I think when it comes to Asia Pacific, India's biggest challenge is to identify areas where it can start with a strong substantial advantage and identify other areas where it really doesn't have that much of advantages. And the challenge will be to balance both. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be significantly difficult. But I think the good part is that today there is an understanding across the Asia Pacific or the Indo-Pacific, to be more specific, that it is important to bring in India as much as possible within the space of functional and strategically sensitive supply chains. I think that really works to India's advantage.
Okay, thanks, Amitendu. In a sense, we are now at the sort of penultimate part of this session. I have no intention of trying to summarize, but I think one of the features that we spoke about, in a sense, it came out, but I think just to draw attention is the increasingly role of service sectors in these global value chains. We've talked about it, but what is now commonly called the servicification of manufacturing, and that indicates that there are a large number of services sectors which are critical to this supply chain management and participation in global value chains. And the question of to what extent the domestic services policies, whether it is liberalization, whether it is the regulatory reform environment, whether it is the standard setting in services wherever relevant, these are becoming extremely critical issues. And that is where this integration, so it's not just manufacturing per se and inputs into manufacturing, but very critical service sectors. And in fact, it covers a large number of service sectors. But just to draw attention to the fact that this is something that would need to be sort of thought of when you are looking at an overall trade and investment strategy as well, because a large part of the value addition in these global value chains will come from the services sector. So just to draw attention of everyone to this, well, first of all, let me thank the four panelists. Of course, Dr. Kookman and Dr. Anisha are not with us currently, but once again, on my personal behalf, I would like to thank each one of them. This is such an intriguing and I would say, in some sense, complex area that it's difficult to compress all these issues into a short session, but my sort of gratitude to the panelists. I think they have been able to do so largely in such a sort of brief period. We have sort of covered a large number of issues that are relevant going forward. Certainly, some of the takeaways that are there in terms of the importance of resilience and sort of building strategies to sort of diversify. We heard Anish speaking on those. One very important, and this is something that is the concept of the lead firm. Now, to what extent either you are able to improve your negotiating power and your ability to attract lead firms, or convert, as Dr. Harshvardhan mentioned, in certain specific sectors, become the lead firm yourself in some sense. And are there specific areas where you could do this? He took an example of a particular area, but I'm sure this is something that Indian industry will have to sort of look at, both of them. So this is something that we need to sort of think about. And then, of course, there is this entire issue, as I said, which, of course, needs no second thought, of improving the cost of doing business, which is the entire physical, digital connectivity space, the trade facilitation part, the regulatory structures, the paperwork, and so on and so forth. Any closing thoughts from the panelists? I think Dr. Harshvardhan Singh wanted to say something. Yeah, please, Harsh.
Thank you very much. A very important point is that the government is actually making efforts to improve and change policy to achieve the objectives we are talking about. However, the feedback one gets when from time to time from industry is that these policies in several cases are not effectively being implemented on the ground. And there are various reasons why that's not happening. The government does seek inputs from the industry on what is troubling them. There are two kinds of models to address this concern. One is that in the case of, and in addition to the policy chain, supply chain kind of approach, which I talked about, one is that in several industries, you actually, in order to be more effective, you need to focus on some key constraints or obstacles which are being created by domestic policy itself. So you choose 3 or 5 major concerns of the industry and make sure that you are actually addressing them. And there are examples of these. In certain industries, such as in pharmaceuticals or medical devices, etc., you need a project-oriented approach where you actually need to implement many things together. There are, in both these, you need to be in consultation with the industry, but you need to be in periodic consultation to monitor with a management information system. What were the concerns mentioned earlier? Have we addressed them? If not, what is needed to do them to address them? So show that commitment with the coordination effort, which is needed, because these issues are not only, say, with commerce or say with the main industry, ministry of the sector per se. So once you establish that and follow that effectively, something the government has tried to do, but in a much more regular, comprehensive manner, then you would have traveled the way to quite some distance. Combine that with the bilateral initiatives. We are going to have a discussion with the US in the coming week. Combine that with other countries in a very result-oriented manner. And I think we will go a larger part of it. So consultation with industry and global lead firms, very important, plus with nations in terms of the policies. Thank you.
Thanks, Harsh. And I will, I think, leave the last word with Harsh. In a sense, these are all thoughts that we need to sort of speak and debate and discuss upon. Once again, let me, on behalf of CII, thank all the panelists, thank the participants, and I do hope that this session will help all of us in getting both a better hold of the changes that are emerging in this important area, and the policy responses that should enable us to meet these challenges. With this, we would end this session. Thanks once again.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chaudhary.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chaudhary.
Thank you.